I know you care about who the Falcons quarterback is going to be, but I care about who's going to protect him. Today, we're making the case for and against keeping Falcons free agent offensive tackle Kaleb McGary.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and of course, your humble host here on this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more by visiting FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. Hey guys, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available Monday through Friday in a variety of podcast platforms, including YouTube. And make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, and you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. And also, make sure you check us out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Of course, you can do so by downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV. So I know there's still a lot to talk about with the Falcons' ongoing quarterback quandary. And I'm sorry to disappoint you if you tuned in today hoping to get more insight on the ongoing Lamar Jackson Falcons quarterback discourse. But to be honest with you guys, I'm tired of talking about the Falcons quarterback, right? And I know probably the people at Locked On would tell me, hey, Aaron, you got to play the hits. But I realize that this conversation is going to go on for probably years. And I don't necessarily feel compelled to have to talk about it every single day. And I know probably some of you guys are exhausted by the constant back and forth about the quarterback. And so I feel like I'm doing you a service today by talking about something else. And so, take your break from the stress. Let's eat our vegetables. And we'll circle back to that concept a little bit later in the show by talking about something that's a little bit less appealing. And that's the Falcons' top free agent, which is offensive tackle, their right tackle, Kaleb McGary. He's the highest ranked Falcon on all the various, free agent lists out there, at least on the majority of them. And today we'll be talking about the case for and against re-signing him. And of course, yesterday we learned with the franchise tag deadline hitting that the Falcons chose to not tag him. And I was happy to see that because, hopefully by the end of today's episode, you'll understand why I was hesitant for the Falcons to spend $18.2 million by slapping the franchise tag on him. But, what came with the reports that the Falcons weren't tagging him was that he was, set to hit the market. And, maybe there's a technicality in there, but I don't know if he's going to hit the market, right? Because when you look at the timeline over the next week or so, right, it starts with Monday, March 13th, where you have the legal tampering period, which is that time, those first 2 days where other teams are allowed to talk to other teams' free agents, right? And so a team like the Raiders or the Bears could talk to Kaleb McGary if they wanted to and negotiate and agree to a contract. And then actual official legitimate free agency doesn't begin till Wednesday, March 15th. And that's when players can officially sign. And there's often been cases the last couple of years where, a player will agree to terms with a new team and then renege on that contract. We saw that with Anthony Barr going from the Jets back to the Vikings 2 years ago, J.D. McKissick last year agreeing with the Bills and then ultimately going back to the Commanders. But until Monday, essentially the Falcons have their exclusive window to negotiate a new deal to keep Kaleb McGary. And so I would sit here and say, sitting here today on Wednesday recording this, is he going to hit the market come Monday/next Wednesday? We'll see. But until we get to Saturday and we haven't heard that, Kaleb McGary hasn't agreed to a new deal, then I'll be like, okay, if we get to Sunday and he hasn't agreed to a new deal, basically, I'll say the odds go up there that Kaleb McGary is going to hit the market and then potentially walks. And is Kaleb McGary walking a good thing? I don't know. But today we'll make the case for and against it. And the simplified version of that is the case for keeping Kaleb McGary is because you literally value stability and you're willing to pay a price for it, right? The case against him is, I guess you would say, you value being better at football, right? As weird as that sounds to say, but like you're going to try to upgrade because you think you can, right? And we've often used the McGary Island analogy to better illustrate this point. And for those of you unfamiliar, McGary Island is a 2021 reference from this podcast where I often defended Kaleb McGary during that season and likened it to being on an island, being marooned on an island. But, you know, it wasn't a great island to be on, but wasn't terrible. It was like a 2-star resort, right? You could do a lot worse than being marooned on an island. Was essentially the argument I made when it came to the Falcons' offensive line struggles, right? You could do a lot worse than Kaleb McGary and the Falcons did in that 2021 year, but we won't go into that. And I think over the last year since then, things have gotten better, right? That 2-star resort has been upgraded to a 3-star resort. And now we're in a situation with Kaleb McGary hitting free agency. It's basically a boat has come by and you're potentially going to get rescued off of this island. And so the case against, this is where it gets confusing. The case against keeping Kaleb McGary is basically you getting on the boat and getting off the island. And it's like, we're going to a new island. There's a 5-star resort out there. We're headed there. And the case for keeping Kaleb McGary is staying on the island. And it's basically, look, I have food and shelter here, so I'm going to chill here. And I think the upsides for both of those paths, both of those choices should be obvious. Both of them have downsides, right? If you get on that boat, if you let Kaleb McGary walk, right, you learn that boat doesn't have GPS. They don't know where the island is. They're going to go out there and they're going to figure it out. Right. And so very quickly that can go from this grand adventure to find this 5-star island to a misadventure pretty quickly. And then the downside of staying on the island, the downside of keeping Kaleb McGary is, even though you have food and shelter, the food gives you bubble guts and the shelter, leaks when it rains. Right. And so you're asking the question, what you're going to do? You're going to get off the island. You're going to stay on the island. Right. So, I will allow you guys to make up your own minds on that subject. But if you want my answer to it, I'm getting off the island. All right. And hopefully by the end of the episode, you'll understand the reasons why I will choose to get on that boat. But, we'll continue this conversation, start that conversation by making the case for not getting on the boat and staying on the island. And we'll get into all of that as we continue today's episode. But it is beyond the midway point of the NBA season, and it is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back, even if your first bet doesn't win. All you got to do is download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. And whether you want to bet on the NBA, and since I know you guys love football, you can bet on the XFL, right? And root for Vic Beasley or root against Vic Beasley. I don't care. Right. But it's going to make rooting for or against, Beasley a little bit more interesting. It's betting for or against his team, the Vegas Vipers. And you can do all that on the app. So make sure you head on over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and make sure you take advantage of this no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets. And again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So let's talk about, the case for keeping Kaleb McGary, staying on the island. You're looking at that boat captain. You're thinking, man, you're pretty sketchy. So I think I'm going to stay here. Yeah, right. Again, you value stability, right? It's the idea of, the known commodity, the lesser evil. And again, lesser evil is not a great way of because nothing is evil about, a football player maybe being better or worse than what you think he should be. But you're looking at how the island's amenities improved, going from 2-star to 3 stars. To continue the analogy, it's essentially Kaleb McGary got better, right? And that matters, right? Because part of the original thesis behind the creation of Kaleb McGary Island here on this podcast was that, contrary to popular opinion, Kaleb McGary did get better over the first 3 years of his NFL career, despite his ups and downs. He was just very inconsistent, right? That was it. That was the issue. It's like he had good games. He had plenty of good games across those 3 years, but he just seemed to have an equal number of bad ones. And any type of progress you thought he was making, would be let down a week or two later because he would have another struggling game. And it especially became more apparent to a lot of folks because when he did struggle, when he did get beat, it was very badly. And you tend to only notice offensive linemen when they mess up, right? It's a big reason why a lot of Falcon fans are very vocally, thinking that Jake Matthews is a middling starter, right? And a lot of that comes from the only times they ever notice Jake Matthews is when he messes up. And when that's, the same thing applies to Kaleb McGary. And they show that on instant replay in super slow motion. So you get to really see that guy, get beat or miss a block or whatever it is that causes the ire, of fans everywhere. And it tends to lead to fans on average being lower on offensive linemen than they should, especially offensive tackles, given that, that is the position that is most likely to get beat because they're facing generally the best pass rushers on opposing teams. All right. Except for when you play the Rams. Right. But it tends to lead to people being lower on offensive linemen, except for when they see a PFF graphic that tells them they're the highest graded player in the NFL. And then all of a sudden he becomes a god to them. And no, that's not a swipe at Chris Lindstrom. That's a swipe at fans. Right. It's just illustrating the extreme opinions that people tend to have on all players. Offensive linemen, quarterbacks, feels very eerily similar to the arguments that you often hear on that. Either he's the greatest, God's gift to football players, or he's terrible and should be run out of the league. But when you talk about Kaleb McGary, you talk about the improvement, right? And the point being, he improved in his first 3 years, not to the degree and at the speed that we hoped, but it all seemed to finally come together in year 4. And that leads you to the case for keeping Kaleb McGary, which is, you pay the guys that deserve it, right? And you got to use air quotes when you say deserves, right? But you got to remember, and I'm often very guilty of forgetting this, but football is a people business first, right? We like to often dehumanize players, treat them like they're video game characters, treat them like they're movable chess pieces in this great grand game of strategy that is, football. But they're people, right? And you pay the guys that quote unquote deserve it, which is, in part a signal to the other players in that locker room, especially the young guys. This is basically, hey, if you work hard, you get better each year, it'll pay off for you. And especially in the case of a player like Kaleb McGary, who had his 5th-year option declined, that's a lesson in perseverance that you would love, to sort of filter throughout the rest of the roster, to build that culture, all that sort of stuff. And, as jaded as I often am, which I very much am, occasionally you got to acknowledge that stuff matters, right? Even if I don't necessarily give it all the attention on this podcast that it often deserves. Another factor in keeping Kaleb McGary and why you feel comfortable doing that and paying him whatever that price is. We'll talk about some of his price tags later when we make the case against him. But part of the reason why you're willing to make that payment is you trust in the coaching. And I've waxed poetic on this podcast over the last, several months about the incredible job that Dwayne Ledford, the Falcons offensive line coach, did in 2022. And the short version of that is you saw the entire unit of the offensive line. Pretty much every player that played this year was better in 2022 than they had been in previous years, right? Evidence in Kaleb McGary, Chris Lindstrom having their best seasons to date, Jake Matthews seemingly finding the fountain of youth and looking the best he has in years as a run blocker, Drew Dahlman's growth, right? And his flashes, the fact that the Falcons had a revolving door at left guard and they really didn't skip a beat offensively, right? You look at Elijah Wilkinson, their main starting left guard. It was the first time he'd ever really played left guard in his NFL career. Seemed solid. Matt Hennessy or Chuma Doga, another player that was kind of a first-time starter at left guard, was fine in his single start, right? Matt Hennessy, right? Struggled 2 years ago when we played him at guard, got pushed around a bunch as center. And you're like, I don't know if this guy's a guard. Right. And then, in the handful of starts he had this year, stepped in and looked pretty natural at that. Then you attribute a lot of that to Dwayne Ledford. And so because you're trusting Dwayne Ledford, you have trust in Kaleb McGary that he's going to either continue to grow under Ledford's tutelage or at least not regress under Ledford's tutelage. Because one of the topics that we'll get into in the case for getting off the island, letting Kaleb McGary go, is labeling him as a 1-year wonder. But that trust in Ledford makes you confident that maybe you're immune to that 1 year being a wonder, and maybe he's a 2 or 3 or 4 year wonder. Another factor in the case for keeping Kaleb McGary is you need him, right? Especially when it comes to the identity of this football team, which is as a run first team, and he's a heck of a run blocker, right? That's the bread and butter of this team, running it right. as we often say, behind your Pro Bowl guard and your top shelf run blocking right tackle. And even in a world where, that we seem to be living in, where the Falcons are moving towards a more balanced offense, trying to get a more potent pass attack, seemingly under Desmond Ridder or maybe somebody else at the quarterback position. And again, we're not talking about quarterbacks on today's episode, but that is an aspect that does not get enough attention when everybody's pushing for the Falcons to add a quarterback that, arguably his greatest weapon is his legs. And I may not be referring to one particular quarterback in particular. I could be talking about multiple quarterbacks that people are pining for out there in the world. But again, we're not talking about that today. At the end of the day, all that we know is Kaleb McGary. We don't know who the quarterback's going to be, but we know Kaleb McGary was a heck of a run blocker. And everybody's favorite website, PFF, had him as one of the highest graded run blockers in the NFL. He was number 5 run blocker overall for all offensive linemen, number 3 among all tackles, and number 1 in terms of right tackles in the league this past year. And so, someone like Kaleb McGary may come along and say, you know what? You spent a lot of time complaining about being on this island, but, those numbers seem to suggest that it's a lot better place than what you seem to think it is. And, we might be a 3-star resort now, but, we're on the verge of being a 3.5-star resort. You never know. Maybe we'll even be a 4-star resort if you don't watch out, right? And so that's essentially the case for keeping Kaleb McGary, but we'll continue today's episode talking about the case against Kaleb McGary, the case for getting on that boat, right? And one of those reasons behind that is, you can sit there and say, you ain't a 3.5-star resort. You're barely a 3-star resort. And in all likelihood, you might regress to being a 2-star resort again. And, if we don't get off the island now, we might be kicking ourselves a year or two from now, where we did not take advantage of the situation and the opportunity that was presented to us this offseason by moving on, which is odd because that whole conversation kind of echoes another position that we're definitely not talking about on today's episode. But that's just weird. I don't know. That's a weird connection that I have in my brain. But we'll move on and talk about that as we continue today's episode. But, before we do that, I recommend you guys check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast, right? One of the elements of moving on for Kaleb McGary is believing in, you can find a quality replacement in this year's draft. And if you want to get more insight into who those potential replacements could be in this year's draft, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast, your daily podcast covering the NFL draft. And you can subscribe to it on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So the case against keeping Kaleb McGary, the case for getting off the island, and we'll cool it with the island analogies because it's getting confusing now. But you see the potential to upgrade, right? That's not the only reason. And one of the reasons that you're worried about keeping Kaleb McGary is longevity, right? Kaleb McGary just turned 28, right? He's getting up there in age, and to a lot of people, 28 doesn't seem like a significant number. It's like, oh, it's still got plenty of time. You could play several more years. Yeah, sure. You can play several more years, but how many more years? And when you go back and you look at all the Falcons starting tackles over, say, the last, 15, 20 years, and look at those guys that did play, made it to age 30 and beyond, you start to see a pattern start to emerge, right? You look at Ryan Schrader. His body started to break down in 2018. That was his age 30 season. You look at Tyson Kalebo, previous right tackle, right? His final year in Atlanta was 2012. That was his age 31 season. And there was a significant drop off in play from previous years for him, right? Now, he still was much better than the guys that the Falcons chose to replace him with, but it was noticeable, right? You go to the previous right tackle, Todd Weiner, right? His last healthy season in Atlanta was at age 31. He got then hurt at age 32, and he was replaced at age 33 by Tyson Kalebo. So there was a clear decline with him. And then you look at Bob Whitfield, not just right tackles, but look at a left tackle. Right, his last season in Atlanta was age 32. He had been on the decline up to that point for a couple of years, and was replaced by Kevin Schaefer, someone that I'm sure only a handful of you guys listening to the podcast. Oh, Kevin Schaefer, I haven't heard that name in a long time. Shout out to you. But yeah, that's not the point. That's a digression. But I think the conclusion is, to point all that out, is there's a clear pattern that suggests that sometime between the ages of 30 and 32, tackles with the Falcons have tended to start to decline, and the team is looking to replace them after that point. And I haven't looked at every other team and every other starting tackle for the last 20 years. That was far too much research than is worth my time. But I would imagine there would be a similar pattern. And so when you apply that sort of expectation to Kaleb McGary, you have this year. He's only 28, so he should be fine in 2023. He'll be 29 in 2024, and then he'll be 30 in 2025. And that's kind of the year where you're like, okay, is this going to start to become an issue at that point? And it becomes a little bit more worrisome with Kaleb McGary, and you wonder a little bit about whether or not he's built to be, this guy that plays for longer than that, is because he's not a particularly athletic guy. And, you wouldn't be able to tell that by you looking at his mock draftable spiderweb graph, because he tested very well at the combine, but it always doesn't show up on the field. It rarely shows up on the field. And you do wonder, as guys get older, their body starts to break down. That's how aging works, right? People like to pretend like, oh, well, they treat it like it's a hit meter in a video game where it's like, oh, you take a certain amount of hits and that's what leads you. No, it's like you just get old, right? That's what happens. And while I think McGary's technique has improved, which is part of the reason why he was able to quote unquote put it all together, or at least put most of it together this year, I wouldn't call Kaleb McGary a technician in the same way I would call Jake Matthews that, right? And so when I look at a player like Jake Matthews, who's, an underrated athlete, but, wins primarily with technique, Jake, at least that style of player, that style of tackle, I believe has a higher chance of being able to play well beyond 30 and possibly 32, because he can survive off of, high quality technique, even as his body starts to deteriorate and his athleticism starts to deteriorate with age. So, I wonder with Kaleb McGary, does he have quite the staying power, And so therefore the conclusion is we might be looking to replace Kaleb McGary in 3 years. And if that's going to be the case, why not just replace him now? And, the 3 years that he would basically be a stopgap at this point in time, it's 3 years you can put into developing a younger, better player, right? And, one of the things that's incentivizing you to going younger and better is it's also cheaper. And you look at McGary again as a stopgap player. Why should I pay a premium price for a stopgap player? And again, premium is a subjective term, but you look at sort of the expectation in terms of his price range. You look at some recent deals signed by right tackles. We go back to December with Jack Conklin, who signed an extension with the Browns, I think a 3 or 4 year extension, averaging $15 million a year and getting $30 million guaranteed. You have Taylor Moton, who signed in July of 2021 in the summer that year, and it was a multi-year extension, averaging $17 million a year and $43 million guaranteed. And you like, Kaleb McGary's not one of those guys. Like Jack Conklin's been a good starter in the league from year one, right? It didn't take him 4 years to become good, right? Same thing with Taylor Moton, right? Taylor Moton has shown that he can be a competent left tackle as well, right? Those guys aren't Kaleb McGary's peers, right? Instead, you're looking at, recent right tackle contracts, and you look at Rob Havenstein. That seems a little bit more on your level because Havenstein kind of was up and down. I'm sure Falcon fans remember Vic Beasley tearing him a new one in that regular season game back in 2016, right? And you look at Rob Havenstein's current contract. He signed a 3-year extension back in this past September, averaging $11.5 million a year with $25 million guaranteed. But instead, Havenstein is like 30 when he signed that extension. Go back to the previous deal he signed in 2019, that 2019 extension, when he was a little closer to Kaleb McGary's current age. That was an $8 million a year contract with $10 million guaranteed. And if you adjust it, the cap back then was like $177 million. It's now $225 million. And you sort of make that adjustment, right? $8 million in 2019 would be about $10.1 million in 2023. And so the conclusion, therefore, is, I kind of think Kaleb McGary's price tag, he's actually worth more closer to $10 million than he is to the $13 million that Pro Football Focus is projecting his market to be on a multi-year deal, right? And that includes $31 million in guaranteed money. Another factor that goes into this conversation in terms of making the case against Kaleb McGary is Sam Baker. And it's not necessarily fair to make that comparison. Kaleb McGary's issues are not quite the same issues that Sam Baker had, which were primarily injury related. But you do wonder what happens when you commit, quote unquote, again to a quote unquote 1-year wonder, right? A guy that has a quote unquote outlier season in a contract year. And again, that's probably not fair, but I'm sure to a lot of you guys, some of that misgivings about paying Kaleb McGary lingers in the back of the mind because it didn't work out with Sam Baker. And I'll admit to you guys, that is also in the back of my mind as well. And that's influencing, why I am willing to move on from Kaleb McGary. And, if you move on from Kaleb McGary, the most likely replacement for him is going to be in the draft because, free agency, we'll see what the market looks like. But, Orlando Brown is going to hit the market. Donovan Smith's going to hit the market. La'el Collins might get cut. There may be some options for the Falcons, but, the whole goal is to, not spend money, right? Clearly, there's some misgivings there. So you can go cheap and draft a player. And the fact that the Falcons are picking at 8 means that they potentially will have their choice of, the premier offensive tackle in this year's draft, similar to what they had the choice of the premier wide receiver in last year's draft with Drake London. And, maybe the Raiders are interested in taking an offensive lineman at 7. They do have needs at right tackle. They do have needs at guard. But it does feel like the Falcons are most likely to be the front runners to get OT1 if they want it. Now, the knock on this draft class is there maybe isn't a true blue top 10 OT1 candidate like we've seen in recent past years, where 2022 class, we had several top 10 tackles like Ike Ekwonu, Evan Neal, Charles Cross, right? 2021, we had Penny Sewell in the top 10, Rashawn Slater, a couple of picks later. Christian Darrisaw was a really solid late first round pick for the Vikings that year. 2020, you had Andrew Thomas in the top 10. Jedrick Wills and Mekhi Becton haven't quite lived up to expectations, but Tristan Wirfs, another top 15 pick, that has turned into one of the best tackles in football over the last 3 years. And so you sit there and you go, is there that type of player that's on comparable level with those guys in this draft class? And that's a question. But I think you could potentially make the case that there is a guy. You look at a player like Broderick Jones out of Georgia, right? He can be compared favorably to Ike Ekwonu, a sort of elite run blocker, particularly in our scheme that, probably needs a lot of development, probably has a lower floor than Ekwonu. Ekwonu was not necessarily a super polished prospect when Carolina took him first off the board at OT1 last year. But you could see that type of potential with Broderick Jones to be a dominant, run blocker, right? You look at Paris Johnson. And while I don't love Paris Johnson as a prospect, I also didn't love Andrew Thomas as a prospect. And Andrew Thomas has turned into a really solid left tackle for the Giants. Not an elite player, but a really solid, top 10, top 12 type of tackle that is just, going to go on and have a very long, successful career and just be solid. Similar to kind of Jake Matthews. Right. And Peter Skoronski, I expressed my skepticisms on him, a couple of mock draft Mondays ago. But with better testing that he showed, I do feel a little bit more optimistic, that he has, Joe Patonio like upside as a guard. Now, do you want to take that player at 8? Again, that's not for me to decide, but it's certainly an option. And even if you're still sitting here going like, I'm still skeptical if that tackle is going to be there at 8, you may conclude looking at this tackle class, and you might be able to say, hey, we can still find quality. It's deep enough that we can find a quality guy on day 2. And that will allow us to use number 8 in the first round on a bigger need or a premium position like corner, like pass rusher. Right. And so it can all work out in that way. And while I know drafting an offensive lineman isn't sexy, going back to the statement I made at the beginning of the show, sometimes you got to eat your vegetables, and that's what drafting an offensive lineman is like. And, the 2 best teams in football, and, I always think comparing, what the Super Bowl teams did is often overused and overrated, but, when it's convenient, I'll use it. Right. And the 2 best teams in football this past year in Kansas City and Philadelphia, they were teams that ate a lot of vegetables over the last couple of years. Right. Kansas City, we saw them invest significant resources 2 years ago in their offensive line and free agency in the draft. Philadelphia has one of the best offensive line coaches in the league in Jeff Stoutland, and has truly been, phenomenal over the last decade developing their offensive linemen, taking, mid-round picks, taking raw developmental players like Jordan Mailata, their left tackle, and turning him into a stud. And of course, Lane Johnson is the best right tackle in football, right? Jason Kelsey's the best center in football, and their guards, Landon Dickerson and Isaac Suomalo, are really solid guards, right? And they just have a pipeline of guys on the back end, right? The Falcons tried to claim an Eagles offensive lineman last summer, but I think someone else got him, or the Eagles brought him back. I can't remember. And so you just look at that situation like, yeah, the Falcons can invest more resources like the Chiefs, and they can develop talent like the Eagles did. Probably lean more towards the Eagles direction, but given that this free agent crop isn't great, but you could still do what the Chiefs did, drafting. They got Creed Humphrey and Trey Smith, right? And so what you conclude based off of that is, if you do invest, if you do eat your vegetables, that may seem like a luxury, drafting a tackle at 8 when there are more pressing concerns, but you can do that, and you have the flexibility to do that if you see this Falcons team be very proactive in free agency, filling those other more pressing needs. And so it's just another reason for people to be, have their eye on free agency and be, hopeful and optimistic that we will see this team be very proactive this March to fill some of these needs, so that if they need to replace Kaleb McGary, they will have the flexibility early in the 2023 draft to do so. And so, it would have been harder, I think, to have that proactiveness in the coming weeks if they had franchise tag Kaleb McGary, and would have essentially an $18 million anchor being a hindrance to them being proactive in March. Not an insurmountable, obstacle or anything like that. Not, infinite mass or anything like that in terms of anchor analogies, but certainly a hindrance. So we'll see how the Falcons approach it. Again, if it was up to me, I would move on, but I have that luxury because I don't got no skin in the game, guys. Right? If the Falcons don't hit on the right tackle in the draft, guess what? I ain't losing my job. I'm still be here on Locked On Falcons, hopefully, God willing. Right? Still talking trash, still complaining about Jalen Mayfield on Locked On Falcons. Right? Like, so I'm good. So that is not the case for Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith and all those guys. So I'll be interested to see what their choice. I will understand either way. Ultimately, it will probably just boil down to, how much guaranteed money are they getting in? Right? It's like, if that number is closer to $15 million guaranteed versus $30 million guaranteed, I'll be happier regardless of which way they go. So that will ultimately kind of decide. And then ultimately time will tell if there's drop off for Kaleb McGary. Time will tell if the Falcons find an adequate replacement for him. So we'll see how that goes. But that's going to do it for us here on today's episode. There's potentially lots to talk about to wrap up the week tomorrow. We can talk more about Lamar Jackson and the quarterback situation. We can talk about Calvin Ridley's Players Tribune article detailing some of the mental health issues that he dealt with, in 2021 before his gambling suspension. It's also Friday, Free Agent Friday, right? That means, we could be looking at more of the internal free agents like Lorenzo Carter that the Falcons could be more intent on keeping, Rashaan Evans potentially be on that list. It'll be an opportunity for me to revise some of my free agent wish lists that we've done over the last week or so. So lots of things to potentially explore in tomorrow's episode. So we'll kind of play it by ear and be open to all these options. But, again, the quarterback conversation is not going away. There's lots of free agent stuff to unpack, but, this is going to be an ongoing story with Kaleb McGary, in addition to the quarterbacks, in addition to Isaiah Oliver, Olamide Zaccheaus, etc. Some of these other guys. So we'll see what develops over the next couple of days. Again, we'll hopefully get some positive news on the Falcons keeping some of these guys, before Monday. And, we'll keep you guys glued to it on here, Locked On Falcons. So continue to make us your first listen. And make sure you check out Locked On NFL Draft for your second listen. Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez of the Draft Network are providing the in-depth coverage on the top prospects, deep dives into sleepers and hidden gems that can change the fortunes of your favorite franchise. And even if you're not necessarily in love with the Falcons' decisions, as I'm sure many of you are right now, you still should be able to check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.